Earth had been on the Council's margin reports for years, a quiet blue world listed as technically spacefaring, but strategically irrelevant. And when the first foreign fleet crossed the Heliopause, the admirals watching from orbit believed the outcome had already been written, because every projection they had ever run said humans fractured under pressure and folded under superior force. And the opening move seemed to confirm it when human diplomats stalled for time and their defense grid remained dark, leading the alien commanders to laugh openly as they broadcast demands that carried the calm certainty of victory, while on Earth people watched the sky with fear that felt old and familiar, yet beneath the surface of panic there was motion, silent systems waking, sealed rooms opening that had not been used in generations. And deep under the Nevada desert, Colonel Aaron Blake stood before a wall of inactive displays, listening to a young technician say in a flat voice that the Council fleet had crossed a red line, and Blake nodded once and said then it is time to tell the truth. And with that order, the assumption that humans would lose began to rot from the inside, because the truth was not a weapon or a ship or a secret base, but a pattern of thinking that had been shaped by centuries of being underestimated. And as the alien fleet advanced, they saw only the obvious, a small navy forming defensive lines near Earth orbit, outdated hulls compared to their own. And the enemy commander spoke to his bridge crew with amusement, saying they will fight bravely for a few minutes, and then it will end. While far away, a woman named Laura Bennett watched telemetry scroll across her console aboard a human vessel that had no visible weapons and whispered to herself that the enemy still did not see, because humanity had learned long ago that showing strength too early invited escalation, and hiding it invited survival. And so the first clash was deliberately clumsy, human ships falling back, shielding flaring, distress calls broadcast in clear channels, all of it feeding the enemy's confidence as they press harder, their formations tightening as predators do when prey shows weakness. And that was when the second layer unfolded. Invisible to sensors calibrated for power rather than absence, as human probes seeded years earlier activated and began to rewrite the space between ships, bending communication delays, altering targeting solutions by fractions. That compounded into disaster, and the alien gunners frowned as their shots missed by margins that made no sense, while on Earth an emergency session the Council watched feeds and congratulated themselves on accurate predictions, unaware that every data packet they received was curated, slowed, and nudged, because humans had never tried to outgun the galaxy. They had tried to outthink it, and when the enemy commander finally ordered a full barrage of the human fleet, did something unexpected. It stopped retreating. Not charging, not counterattacking, simply stopping. And that pause created confusion, a hesitation that humans exploited with quiet precision as Laura spoke into an open channel, saying, "You should have asked why we let you get this close." And across the alien fleet systems began to fail not explosively, but politely, interfaces freezing, power rerouting itself, safety protocols locking down weapons that suddenly reported themselves as unsafe to fire, and panic crept into voices that had known only certainty, because the truth they were learning was not that humans were stronger, but that humans had prepared for losing so thoroughly that losing had become just another scenario to manage. And as the battle stretched and the alien ships found themselves isolated, unable to coordinate, each fighting a war slightly out of sync with the others, while human vessels moved with calm intent, disabling rather than destroying, hurting rather than hunting, and on Earth Blake watched the feeds and felt no triumph, only a heavy resolve, because this was a moment the galaxy would finally see what humans had learned about survival, that was not about winning fast, but about making sure the enemy understood why they lost. And when the enemy commander finally demanded terms, his voice carried confusion instead of rage, asking what humans wanted, Laura answered simply saying, "We want you to know that this was never a fair fight, and that knowledge would spread faster." Then fear, reshaping assumptions across the stars. And as the first alien ships powered down under human control, the council chambers fell silent, their models collapsing, because the truth had arrived at last, not as a dramatic explosion, but as a cold realization that humans had never planned to win by force alone. They had planned to win by changing the rules so completely that by the time the enemy learned the truth, it was already too late. The surrender transmissions rippled outward to the alien fleet in uneven waves. Some ships complied immediately, while others hesitated, their commanders arguing that systems failure could not mean defeat, and that delay bought time, But time was the one resource humanity had already taken from them, because the same probes that had been targeting solutions now bent perception, stretching seconds into minutes for some, and compressing hours into heartbeats for others. And as confusion deepened, the human fleet shifted with deliberate calm, moving disabled vessels into stable orbits and marking resistant ones with precision strikes that cut engines without rupturing hulls, a restraint that unsettled the enemy more than open destruction would have, because it forced them to confront intent rather than rage, and on the surface of Earth news feeds showed the battle in fragments, commentators speculating wildly while governments maintained a practiced silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And in a secure room beneath the Rockies, President Daniel Moore listened as advisors spoke in careful tones about diplomatic consequences, about how victory shaped narrative, and Moore replied that this was not victory yet. This was introduction, because the galaxy still believed humans had simply gotten lucky, and luck could be dismissed, while preparation could not. And preparation was what they intended to display next, as Laura Bennett received updated orders, routing her ship toward the alien command carrier, a massive structure bristling with redundant systems that now sat adrift, its crew trapped in a web of internal lockdowns that refused all overrides. And as she approached, she opened a channel, not to demand surrender, but to explain, telling the enemy commander that his ship was safe, his crew unharmed, and that humans would board shortly to restore basic life support to non-critical areas, a courtesy that left him silent for several long seconds before he asked why. And Laura answered that fear spread faster than death, and humans preferred their enemies afraid long enough to learn, and when the boarding teams crossed the gap, they did so unarmed, wearing only utility suits and carrying tools instead of rifles, which shocked the alien crew into compliance more effectively than any threat could have, because it overturned every expectation of conquest they had been taught. And as systems came back online under human supervision, the commander was escorted to a quiet chamber where a screen flickered to life, revealing Colonel Blake, who did not posture or threaten, but spoke plainly, saying that the council would soon hear many stories about what happened here, and most of them would be wrong. And the commander asked what story humans would tell, and Blake replied that humans would tell the truth, that they had been attacked, that they had responded proportionally, and that they had chosen restraint because annihilation taught nothing. And this unsettled the commander more than defeat ever had, because it implied a moral framework he did not understand, one that valued consequence over dominance. And as the captured fleet stabilized, signals began to arrive from distant systems as other powers noticed the sudden silence where aggressive confidence had once broadcast, and analysts scrambled to reinterpret data they had long ignored, patterns of human expansion that now looked less chaotic and more deliberate. While on Earth, Laura watched the first alien prisoners transferred under guard, their posture stiff, eyes scanning for tricks that never came, and she felt the weight of what followed, because she knew this was only the first truth the enemy would learn, that humans did not need to win loudly to win completely. And as the council finally reconvened in emergency session, their representatives demanding explanations, the captured commander spoke for the first time without anger, telling them that humans had not overwhelmed them with force, but with patience, and that the galaxy had misunderstood the species it tried to break, because humans had built their power around surviving loss, around planning for failure so thoroughly that failure itself became a tool. And as those words spread, fear took on a new shape across the stars. Not fear of human weapons, but fear of human thinking, because an enemy who expected to lose and prepared anyway was an enemy who could not be easily defeated, and the war that had begun with certainty now paused in uneasy silence, the kind that precedes understanding, as humanity prepared to reveal the next layer of truth. The pause that settled over contested space felt unnatural to observers across the galaxy, because wars did not usually slow into quiet contemplation. They burned or they ended, and this uneasy stillness forced every watching power to look closer to humanity rather than past it. And within that silence, humans moved carefully, reopening diplomatic channels they had ignored for decades and sending envoys not in armored dreadnoughts, but in modest ships crewed by people trained more as listeners than negotiators, while the alien fleets that had once postured near Earth now held position at safer distances, their commanders wary of provoking responses they no longer understood. And in a neutral system, a council delegation arrived to debrief their captured commander, expecting excuses or blame. But he spoke with measured restraint, explaining how human tactics had never violated known physical laws, yet had rendered superior force irrelevant, and how the most unsettling moment had not been system failure, but the realization that humans had anticipated every emotional reaction the invasion produced, from overconfidence to panic, and had designed responses for each. And as analysts replayed the engagement frame by frame, they began to see it: the deliberate timing of retreats, the careful exposure of vulnerability, the way humans had allowed losses early not because they were weak, but because they were teaching the enemy how to behave. And on Earth, President Moore addressed the public for the first time since the invasion began, his words calm and unadorned, telling people that the danger was not over, but that humanity had shown the galaxy who it was: a species that survived by learning, adapting, and preparing for worse cases others refused to imagine. And this message was rebroadcast far beyond Earth through unofficial channels as alien populations, curious and uneasy, sought to understand the species that had defied expectations, while Laura Bennett attended a quiet briefing where Colonel Blake outlined what came next: not conquest or retaliation, but demonstration, a controlled release of information that showed the depth of human planning, without revealing every detail, because power once fully revealed losses to turn value. And as the captured alien ships were repaired enough to return home under escort, their crews carried stories that contradicted centuries of doctrine, stories of humans who treated enemies as thinking beings rather than obstacles. And this fractured confidence in distant militaries as officers quietly wondered what else they had misunderstood. And within the council chambers, arguments grew heated as factions blamed intelligence failures or political arrogance. But beneath the noise, a deeper fear took root: that humanity's greatest strength was not any single technology, but a cultural habit of preparing for collapse, a mindset forged by centuries of internal conflict and environmental struggle, and that habit made them unpredictable in ways models could not easily simulate. And when a smaller power attempted a probing attack on human outposts weeks later, expecting a distracted response, they found instead a perfectly calibrated counter that ended the skirmish before it escalated, reinforcing the lesson that humans were always ready, always watching. And as these events accumulated, the narrative shifted, no longer about a single failed invasion, but about a pattern of encounters where humans emerged, unbroken and oddly restrained. And this forced the galaxy to confront the truth the enemy had learned too late: that humans did not fear losing because they had built their civilization on surviving it, and that any power seeking to dominate them would have to fight not just fleets or armies, but an entire species accustomed to adversity, patient under pressure, and quietly relentless in defense of its future. As the months passed after the failed invasion, the galaxy adjusted its posture in subtle ways that only seasoned observers noticed: fleets lingering farther from human space, trade convoys rerouting to avoid unnecessary proximity, and intelligence agencies rewriting threat assessments that had once dismissed Earth as a minor regional concern. And within those quiet shifts, humanity continued its work without spectacle, reinforcing colonies, rotating crews, and running scenario after scenario through systems that never slept, because the truth they understood was that attention faded quickly and complacency followed, and they refused to allow either. While Colonel Blake oversaw joint exercises that looked routine on the surface but tested layers of coordination no outsider would suspect, and Laura Bennett took command of a new assignment, escorting returning alien vessels to neutral zones, where she listened more than she spoke, absorbing rumors and half-formed fears that spread among the stars. And those fears told her more than any official report, because they revealed how deeply the encounter had shaken assumptions. And on Earth, President Moore met with advisors who argued that now was the time to press advantage, to demand concessions or establish dominance. But Moore shook his head and said dominance was fragile and understanding was durable, and that the enemy had learned one truth, but the rest of the galaxy still needed time to learn it safely. And so humanity chose patience again, releasing carefully curated records of the battle that showed restraint and proportional response, narratives that contrasted sharply with the enemy's original threats. And these records circulated through civilian networks beyond the reach of official censorship, planting doubt in places power alone could not reach, while alien military academies quietly added new case studies that students studied with discomfort, because the lessons did not end with tactics, but questioned cultural blind spots. And in one distant system, a young alien officer watched the footage and realized that humans had not panicked when outmatched. They had become methodical, and that realization unsettled him more than any weapon, because it implied a species that grew more dangerous under pressure rather than less. And back near it, a long-range sensor picked up an anomaly that should not have existed: A coalition fleet assembling far beyond declared space, and when analysts traced its origin, they saw a familiar pattern of overconfidence repeating itself, and Blake briefed more without alarm, explaining that this too had been anticipated, that deterrents always lag behind reality, and that some would always need to test the boundary themselves. And as orders went out quietly to reposition assets, Laura felt the calm certainty that had replaced fear since the first battle, because she knew the enemy was still learning, still reacting, while humanity had already moved on to the next step. And when the coalition fleet finally crossed into contested space, expecting a response shaped by previous wars, they encountered something far worse than resistance. They encountered a species that already adapted to their presence, already integrated the lessons of the last conflict, and was prepared not just to survive another attempt, but to ensure that this time the truth would spread even faster, reshaping the galaxy's understanding before denial could take root again. The approach of the coalition fleet did not trigger alarms or public speeches, because humanity had learned that anticipation was more effective when it remained invisible, and as the massive formation advanced under the assumption that scale itself created inevitability. Human assets dispersed rather than consolidated, civilian traffic adjusted course days in advance under routine advisories, and defensive platforms that had appeared dormant shifted into positions that looked accidental to outside observers, while deep within command network predictive models updated in real time, not asking how to defeat the fleet, but how the fleet believed it would be defeated, because that belief determined every choice its commanders would make. And Colonel Blake watched those projections with a quiet focus, noting how often alien doctrine relied on overwhelming presence to force capitulation, and he ordered no dramatic counterformation, instead instructing units to mirror civilian behavior, to look unprepared, to reinforce the illusion that humans were still reacting rather than guiding events. And as the coalition crossed deeper into contested space, they broadcast demands framed as ultimatums, confident that a show of unity would succeed where a single empire had failed. And on Earth the public saw only fragments, official statements urging calm, while Laura Bennett escorted a group of alien observers granted limited access to human logistics hubs. A calculated transparency meant to show normalcy rather than secrecy, and those observers whisper among themselves as they saw how smoothly systems ran without visible stress, because calm under threat contradicted everything they'd been taught about fear-driven species. And when the coalition fleet finally deployed into an attack posture, the human response was immediate but understated. Navigation beacons across the region adjusted by fractions, forcing enemy formations to compensate constantly, fuel consumption spiking, as ships corrected courses they did not realize were being nudged. And then communications delays appeared, not full jamming, but enough latency to erode trust in shared data, commanders questioning whether their neighbors saw the same battlefield. And as tension rose within the coalition, human units began targeted actions that looked offensive but carried strategic weight, disabling supply tenders, isolating command relays, never striking flagships directly, because humanity wanted disagreement to bloom inside the enemy ranks. And it did, as coalition members accused one another of poor coordination, of withholding support. And as that friction grew, the truth emerged again, not announced but demonstrated, that humans understood alliance psychology better than those alliances understood themselves. And when a smaller contingent broke formation and attempted an aggressive thrust toward Earth space, it was intercepted by a minimal force that dismantled the advance with such efficiency that the remaining coalition commanders hesitated, suddenly aware that escalation only clarified human responses rather than overwhelming them. And in that hesitation, Blake authorized a broadcast, not a threat, but an explanation, calmly outlining the sequence of events that would follow if the fleet continued forward, including projected losses and political fallout. A forecast delivered with clinical precision that left no room for heroic reinterpretation, and the coalition listened in stunned silence, because the projections aligned uncomfortably well with their own worst-case models, and one by one ships powered down weapons, commanders choosing survival over pride. And as the fleet withdrew under watchful humans, sensors of lessons spread faster than any propaganda could have, that humanity did not need to conquer to dominate outcomes. It only needed to understand the systems others relied on and gently remove the assumptions that kept them coherent. And as the stars returned to uneasy normalcy, Laura stood at a viewport, watching the last coalition vessels retreat, and felt no satisfaction, only a steady resolve, because she knew this was not an ending but a turning point. the moment when the galaxy finally accepted that humans would not lose because they had already accepted loss as a teacher and learned from it better than anyone else. In the aftermath of the Coalition's withdrawal, the galaxy did what it always did after a shock. It tried to explain away, and pundits argued that the retreat proved humans preferred manipulation to strength, that their victories were circumstantial, fragile, and dependent on unique conditions that could be countered with the right preparation. And humanity let those arguments circulate unchallenged because they served a purpose, buying time while attention drifted and curiosity replaced. Alarm. And during that lull, humans quietly expanded cooperative frameworks with neutral systems, offering navigation assistance, disaster response protocols, and shared research that seemed benign but embedded human standards into everyday operations across dozens of regions. And Laura Bennett found herself stationed at Mixed Species Coordination Hub, where routine traffic flowed through human-managed networks. And she observed how quickly other species adapted to interfaces that rewarded transparency and punished aggression with inefficiency rather than force. And this subtle conditioning did more than any treaty to reshape behavior. While Colonel Blake briefed internal councils on the next likely phase, warning that denial often hardened into desperation, and that some power would attempt a decisive demonstration to shatter the narrative humans were building. And he was proven right when long-range sensors detected a weapons test in a remote system, a star destabilization, event framed as a warning shot meant to reassert fear. And analysts across the galaxy debated whether this crossed a line, while on Earth Moore convened a small group and listened as Blake explained that humanity had planned for this too, because the ultimate truth they needed to convey was not that humans could defend themselves, but that they could absorb escalation without losing coherence. And so the response was not military but informational, as humanity released detailed analysis of the test within hours, breaking down the engineering flaws, the environmental damage, and the strategic limitations of such weapons. And this transparency robbed the act of its intended terror, turning it into a case study rather than a threat. And when Laura watched alien delegates argue over the data, she saw something shift. Fear giving way to embarrassment, because the weapon that was meant to intimidate now looked crude under human scrutiny. And as days passed without retaliation, the galaxy realized that escalation had failed to provoke the expected reaction. And this forced a recalibration more profound than defeat, because it revealed that humans did not operate on the same emotional triggers as others, and that their restraint was not weakness but control. And as trade resumed and fleets stood down, the truth the enemy had learned continued to spread, that humanity would not lose because it did not measure success the same way. It measured survival, stability, and the long arc of influence, and by those measures it was already winning. As the shock of failed intimidation settled into a wary acceptance, a deeper transformation began across interstellar society, because institutions that had once thrived on dominance found their leverage eroding when confronted with human methods that favored predictability and shared benefit over fear. And this erosion manifested quietly in revised doctrines, budget reallocations, and the slow retirement of admirals whose certainty had become a liability, while humanity remained outwardly modest, continuing to host joint research initiatives and emergency response drills that drew participation from rivals who would never have agreed to formal alliances. And Laura Bennett chaired coordination briefings where alien captains deferred to human traffic control without resentment, simply because the systems worked, and that practicality softened edges that ideology never could, while Colonel Blake monitored intelligence, suggesting a final gambit forming at the fringes, a covert consortium of hardliners pooling resources to engineer a crisis they believed would force humans into open war. And rather than intercepting it outright, Blake advised patience, arguing that exposure mattered more than prevention, because the lesson needed witnesses. And when the engineered crisis unfolded as a cascading failure along a densely traveled corridor, threatening civilian shipping from multiple species, human response units were already en route, rerouting traffic, stabilizing reactors, and deploying aid before blame could be assigned. And the conspirators watched their leverage dissolve as lives were saved and gratitude flowed toward the very species they intended to provoke. And when evidence of the plot surfaced through transparent audits built into the response systems, the backlash was swift and internal, member governments disavowing the scheme to preserve standing within networks they now relied upon, and the conspirators found themselves isolated not by human force but by collective refusal, a consequence more enduring than punishment. And Laura addressed Mixed Assembly afterward, her words simple stating that humans would continue to help because stability benefited everyone, but that attempts to manufacture fear would always fail against preparation rooted in care for outcomes rather than appearances, and the assembly listened in thoughtful silence, because the truth had sharpened into clarity, that humanity did not win by crushing enemies, it won by making antagonism inefficient. And as weeks turned into months, the galaxy adjusted again, this time with intent, adopting standards that mirror human practices because they reduced risk and increased trust, and in doing so they unknowingly extended human influence beyond borders or fleets, embedding it into the routines of daily travel and trade. And Blake reflected that this had always been the plan, to render the question of whether humans would lose irrelevant by changing what losing meant. And as the stars hummed with orderly traffic and once hostile powers coordinated without coercion, the enemy's hard-learned truth stood undeniable, that humanity could not be forced into defeat because it had designed a future where resilience was a default and cooperation the path of least resistance. The final reckoning did not arrive as a battle or a declaration, but as a gradual recognition that spread through every layer of galactic life, from high councils to remote trade outposts, that the age of assuming humanity would eventually lose had quietly ended, and this recognition altered decisions in ways no treaty ever could, because merchants planned routes with human stability in mind. Governments measured risk against human response models, and militaries trained not for conquest of Earth but for avoidance of miscalculation. And on Earth, President Moore gave his last address on the matter, stating simply that humanity sought no throne among the stars, only a future where survival did not require domination, and those words carried weight because they aligned perfectly with observed behavior. While Colonel Blake retired from public command, his work complete, knowing that the systems humanity had built would outlast any single strategist, and Laura Bennett stood on the observation deck of a transit hub watching ships of dozens of species move in synchronized flows. Their navigation guided by standard humans had helped design, and she understood that this was a true outcome of the conflict, not victory over an enemy, but the restructuring of expectations. Because the enemy had learned the truth too late that humans would not lose by force, by fear, or by attrition, since they had long ago accepted loss as a condition of existence and engineered their civilization to endure it. And as new generations across the galaxy studied the early invasion as a turning point, the lesson was taught without bitterness, that underestimating humanity had been a mistake not because humans were cruel or unstoppable, but because they were patient, adaptive, and relentlessly focused on long-term survival. And in that focus they had rewritten the rules of power itself, ensuring that any future conflict would be judged not by who struck hardest, but by who could sustain meaning, stability, and purpose when everything else fell apart. And in that measure the truth stood unchallenged. Humanity had never been destined to lose, because it built itself to continue when others could not. And the galaxy would forever move forward under the quiet understanding that provoking such a species was not a gamble worth taking.